7 years ago, Emily left her mother, Mrs. Johnson, a kind elderly woman, in a secluded house outside of town. She abandoned her in pursuit of a life of wealth and comfort she believed she deserved. Promising to return and take care of her mother once she achieved success, Emily left without noticing the silent tears that fell from Mrs. Johnson's eyes. But first, let's rewind to the beginning to discover what life was like for this family. And don't forget to like and follow our channel, Real Live Story, for your daily dose of inspiration. Going back to the start of Emily's journey, we witnessed the love and dedication of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. In their middle age and after many years of marriage, they welcomed their only daughter, Emily, with joy that overflowed from their hearts. Though they faced initial challenges with conception, Emily's birth was welcomed as a miracle, filling their lives with new light and purpose. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson devoted themselves entirely to their daughter, nurturing her with unconditional love, strong values, and careful upbringing. Every moment was an opportunity to create precious memories together. From park strolls to cozy nights reading stories in bed, the Johnson family home was always filled with laughter, hugs, and warm affection. Even in their middle age, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson made the most of every moment with Emily, encouraging her interests, supporting her dreams, and sharing life's lessons with her. Their daughter was the center of their worlds, and they were determined to provide her with a childhood full of love and happiness. Over the years, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's unwavering love for Emily only grew, shaping her into a kind, compassionate, and resilient woman. They knew that even as time led them into old age, their love for her would remain eternal, like a guiding light on her journey through life. As time passed, Emily, now immersed in a world of appearances and emptiness, discovered the inheritance left by her father, who passed away while she was away. Driven by greed, she returns to her mother's house, envisioning an inheritance that would provide even more luxury. As Emily entered adolescence, a tumultuous phase of transition began to pull her away from the parents who loved her so much. Like many young people, she sought her own identity and independence, often leading her to emotionally distance herself from Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Emily began to show a rude and impatient attitude towards her parents, often responding with grumbling and rebellion to their attempts at guidance and affection. She closed herself off in her own world, seeking validation and acceptance among her peers, often at the expense of her parents' patience and understanding. The Johnsons, in turn, faced the challenge of balancing their concern with the need to give Emily space to grow and learn from her own experiences. They struggled to keep lines of communication open, offering unconditional love and support, even in the face of the growing emotional barriers imposed by their daughter. Despite the difficulties, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson remained steadfast in their commitment to guide and love Emily even in the toughest moments. They knew that adolescence was a passing phase and that love and patience would be crucial in helping Emily overcome her challenges and find her way back to them. At 23, Emily entered into a relationship with a guy and, deeply in love, made the decision to move in with him, even without her parents' approval. This abrupt and unconsulted choice was a shock to Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who had invested so much time and resources in her college education. Emily dropped out of the college she was attending, leaving behind the plans and dreams her parents had for her. This sudden and impulsive decision caused profound disappointment for the Johnsons, who found themselves unable to understand what had led their daughter to take such a direction. While Emily delved into her new relationship and adult life, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson faced the challenging task of dealing with a sense of loss and worry. They wondered if they had failed in some aspect as parents, questioning what they could have done differently to prevent their daughter from making such a drastic decision. Despite the pain and disappointment, the Johnsons tried to keep the lines of communication open with Emily, expressing their concerns and offering support even though she was distant. They knew that, in the end, their daughter would need to find her own way in life, but they hoped that, with time, she would realize the value of education and family support. Shortly after Emily left home, a tragedy shook the Johnson family even further: the passing of the patriarch, Mr. Johnson. His departure left a profound void in the hearts of his wife and daughter, bringing forth a mix of emotions, including sadness, shock, and regret. When Emily returned home after hearing about her father's passing, her concerns and interests seemed focused solely on the material possessions he had left behind. Her cold and indifferent approach to grieving and the emotional impact of her father's loss left Mrs. Johnson devastated and disappointed. As Mrs. Johnson grappled with mourning her husband's loss and the need to deal with the bureaucratic matters that followed, she found herself confronted with Emily's indifference towards the emotional aspects of her father's passing. Her daughter's lack of empathy and compassion left her hurt and confused, questioning where she had failed as a mother. Emily, immersed in her own concerns and interests, failed to realize the impact of her actions on her mother. Her exclusive focus on material possessions reflected a distorted view of family priorities and values, revealing a lack of understanding of the true meaning of love and mutual support in times of hardship. While Emily continued to press for answers about her father's inheritance, Mrs. Johnson struggled to find comfort and solace amidst grief and pain. The sadness of losing her husband was compounded by the sense of emotional isolation caused by her daughter's distant attitude. After reading the will and confirming her share of the inheritance, Emily wasted no time in demanding her portion of her father's savings. With a determined look, she expressed her intention to move to another state in search of new opportunities and a future she believed to be more prosperous. For Mrs. Johnson, the news of her daughter's imminent departure was another emotional blow amidst mourning her husband's loss. Despite the pain and sadness she felt, she tried to understand Emily's desires and aspirations, sincerely wishing that her daughter would find the happiness and success she longed for. Emily, on the other hand, was determined to move forward with her plans, leaving behind the home and town where she grew up, along with her mother. Promising a prosperous and promising future, she assured Mrs. Johnson that she would soon return to share her triumphs and achievements. As they bid farewell, Mrs. Johnson felt a mix of emotions, wavering between pride in her daughter's growth and maturity and sadness at her impending departure. She held on to the hope that, despite the physical distance, family ties would remain strong and unbreakable, sustained by mutual love and understanding. Thus, Emily set off in search of new opportunities and challenges, leaving her mother behind, who remained at home, hoping for better days and sincerely wishing that her daughter's future would be as bright as she imagined. Over the months and years, Emily moved on with her life in another state, growing further apart from her mother, Mrs. Johnson. She didn't keep regular contact, failing to call, text, or visit her mother, even though she knew that these simple actions could bring comfort and joy to her heart. The only news Emily received about her mother came from friends she still had in her hometown, who occasionally mentioned how Mrs. Johnson was doing. However, Emily showed little interest in knowing about her mother's life beyond the basics, only caring to find out if she was still alive. This lack of involvement and concern for her mother's well-being saddened those who witnessed the situation from afar, seeing how Emily seemed disconnected from family responsibilities and bonds. The relationship between mother and daughter, already fragile due to Emily's previous choices, now seemed even more distant and neglected. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson stayed at home, yearning for her daughter's contact, longing to hear her voice or receive a visit. She deeply felt Emily's absence in her life and the void left by the lack of communication and affection. Despite this, she held on to hope that one day her daughter would realize the importance of nurturing family bonds and seeking reconciliation. After 7 years of distance and disconnection, Emily began to plan her return to her hometown, but not driven by a genuine desire for reconciliation or reconnection with her mother, Mrs. Johnson. Instead, her motives were selfish and motivated by greed, as she hoped her mother's old age would result in her death and the subsequent inheritance of the remaining assets. These 7 distant years had seen Emily continue her journey in pursuit of her own ambitions and goals, while her mother remained at home, dealing with the challenges of everyday life and the weight of loneliness caused by her daughter's absence. However, Emily was unaware of the impact of her indifference and lack of contact on her mother's heart, as her thoughts were fixed only on the prospect of inheriting the remaining assets. The idea of returning home and waiting for her mother's death as an opportunity to claim her last possessions was a grim and selfish plan. Emily seemed willing to completely disregard any feelings of love or compassion in favor of her own personal gain, revealing the extent of her unchecked ambition and lack of consideration for her mother's feelings and well-being. As Emily mapped out her plans and geared up to head back to her hometown, Mrs. Johnson carried on with her life, perhaps unaware of her daughter's true intentions. She remained alone, holding on to hope for a day when she and Emily could reconcile and restore the relationship they had lost over the years. However, Emily's return wouldn't be a warm reunion between mother and daughter, but rather an opportunity for her to advance her selfish pursuit of material wealth, completely disregarding the true meaning of family and love. Upon returning to her hometown after 7 years of absence, Emily is met with an entirely unexpected reality. Contrary to her selfish expectations, she discovers there's no fortune waiting for her. But what's even more surprising is that her mother, Mrs. Johnson, isn't the frail and abandoned woman she imagined. Emily learns that during her absence, her mother found support and comfort in the humble and generous people of the neighborhood. These folks became a true family for Mrs. Johnson, offering love, companionship, and care when she needed it most. Furthermore, Emily finds out that her mother used the financial resources left by her father wisely and selflessly. Instead of hoarding wealth for herself, Mrs. Johnson invested in her own well-being and that of others in the community. She turned their modest home into a welcoming refuge for the needy, providing emotional support, food, and shelter for those in need. Upon uncovering this truth, Emily is confronted with the impact of her own actions. Shocked and frustrated by the absence of a substantial inheritance, Emily reacts impulsively and selfishly. Feeling betrayed and deceived by the lack of material wealth she expected to inherit, she confronts her mother, Mrs. Johnson, aggressively and threateningly. With sharp words and harsh accusations, Emily claims that her mother is mentally unfit and insinuates that she has gone crazy by not leaving a substantial inheritance to her daughter. Completely disregarding her mother's love and sacrifices over the years, Emily is blinded by greed and unchecked ambition. Faced with Emily's threats to settle the matter legally, Mrs. Johnson is confronted with the cruelty of her own daughter and the depth of her disappointment. Despite the pain and sadness caused by Emily's words, Mrs. Johnson maintains her composure, refusing to succumb to her daughter's resentment and anger. With serenity and dignity, Mrs. Johnson tries to explain to Emily that true wealth is not measured in material possessions, but rather in values such as love, compassion, and generosity. She pleads with Emily to recognize the deeper meaning of life and find peace in her heart, instead of seeking only material gratification. However, Emily remains obstinate in her pursuit of wealth and status, ignoring her mother's pleas and determined to proceed with her legal threats. Her selfish and inhumane attitude reveals the depth of her spiritual blindness and her lack of understanding of what truly matters in life. As the tension between mother and daughter reaches its peak, it becomes clear that the real battle is not for material inheritance, but for Emily's soul and heart, which is lost in her pursuit of material wealth and power, without realizing that true wealth lies within herself, waiting to be discovered through love and compassion. Get ready for the next gripping and inspiring stories. Like and follow our Real Live Story channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on all our captivating narratives. Your daily dose of inspiration is just a click away. Get ready for a new story that will tug at your heartstrings. In the upcoming episode of Real Live Story, we'll delve into the tale of a husband abandoned by his wife after a tragic accident left him in a wheelchair. Don't miss out on this story of resilience, love, and rediscovery. Stay tuned and turn on notifications to catch every detail.